The dusty Afghan compound stretched before them like a maze of crumbling walls and shadows. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez adjusted her medical pack one more time and checked her sidearm. At 26, she had been a Navy medic for 8 years, but this was her first deployment with a SEAL team. The other operators called her Doc, but she could feel their skepticism every time they looked at her. She was small, barely 5'4", and to them, she was just the medic. Commander Jake Morrison gathered his team around the tactical map spread across an overturned crate. His weathered face bore the scars of 15 years in special operations, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. The mission was straightforward on paper. Extract a high-value intelligence asset from a Taliban compound before enemy reinforcements arrived. But Morrison knew that no mission was ever really straightforward. "Listen up," Morrison's voice cut through the desert wind. "We go in fast, grab Blackbird, and get out. Doc stays with the vehicles until we need her." He glanced at Rodriguez, not unkindly, but with the protective instinct of a commander who had lost too many good people. Rodriguez wanted to speak up, to remind them that she had been through the same combat medical training as any Special Forces medic, but she held her tongue. She had learned early in her career that respect was earned, not given. Tonight she would prove herself one way or another. The team moved through the darkness like shadows. Rodriguez followed at the rear, her medical supplies distributed between her pack and the tactical vest that felt too big on her small frame. She had modified her gear setup over the years, finding ways to carry everything she needed while still being able to move quickly. Other medics had mocked her meticulous preparation, but Rodriguez knew that in combat, the difference between life and death often came down to having the right tool at the right moment. The compound was quiet as they approached. Too quiet. Morrison held up his fist, and the team froze. Through her night vision goggles, Rodriguez could see the tension in the operator's shoulders. Something was wrong. "Alpha Team report," Morrison whispered into his radio. Static answered him. "Bravo Team, do you copy?" More static. Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. She had been on enough missions to recognize the signs of an ambush. The intelligence had been wrong, or worse, they had been betrayed. Either way, they were walking into a trap. Morrison made quick hand signals to his team. They would proceed with the extraction, but now they assumed hostile contact was imminent. Rodriguez checked her medical supplies one more time, running through the triage protocols in her mind. In a few minutes, she might be the only thing standing between her teammates and death. The first shots came from the roof of the main building. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Taliban fighters opened fire from concealed positions throughout the compound. Morrison's team scattered for cover behind concrete barriers and abandoned vehicles, returning fire with precision that came from years of training. "Doc, stay back!" Morrison shouted over the gunfire, but Rodriguez was already moving. She had spotted Petty Officer First Class Tommy Chen take a round to the shoulder. He was behind cover but bleeding heavily, and from her position she could see that the wound was worse than it looked. Chen was trying to keep fighting, but he was losing too much blood too fast. Rodriguez sprinted across 20 feet of open ground under enemy fire, sliding behind Chen's position just as bullets sparked off the concrete above her head. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were steady as she cut away Chen's tactical vest and examined the wound. "How bad is it, Doc?" Chen asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live," Rodriguez replied, already working to stop the bleeding. "But you're done for tonight." The bullet had torn through Chen's deltoid muscle and nicked the subclavian artery. Rodriguez had seen wounds like this before, and she knew Chen had maybe 10 minutes before blood loss would put him in shock. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze and applied pressure while scanning the battlefield for her next patient. That was when she saw Commander Morrison take a round to the leg. Morrison stumbled but kept firing, emptying his rifle magazine at Taliban fighters who were trying to flank their position. Rodriguez could see dark blood spreading across his pants. and she knew the wound was serious. But Morrison was 50 feet away, and between them lay a killing field of crossfire. "Commander's hit!" someone shouted. Rodriguez looked at the tactical situation and made a calculation that went against everything she had been taught about medical protocol. Instead of calling for Morrison to fall back to her position, she decided to go to him. She grabbed her aid bag and prepared to cross the most dangerous ground on the battlefield. "Doc, negative!" Morrison shouted, seeing her intention. "Stay in cover!" But Rodriguez was already moving. She had studied the enemy firing patterns for the past 3 minutes, and she had identified a brief window when the shooters would be reloading. She sprinted forward in a crouch, weaving between pieces of concrete debris as bullets whined past her ears. She reached Morrison just as his leg gave out. The commander was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were still sharp with command authority. Rodriguez immediately began working on the wound, which turned out to be worse than she had feared. The bullet had shattered Morrison's femur and damaged the femoral artery. "I need to get you out of here, sir," Rodriguez said, applying a tourniquet with practiced efficiency. "Negative, Doc. We don't leave until we have Blackbird." Morrison pointed toward the main building where their intelligence asset was supposedly being held. The problem was that Taliban reinforcements were pouring into the compound from 3 different directions, and Morrison's team was outnumbered 5-1. "Sir, you need immediate surgical intervention or you're going to lose that leg." Morrison's response was interrupted by a new sound that made Rodriguez's blood run cold, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. "Incoming!" someone screamed. The first explosion threw dirt and concrete fragments in all directions. The Taliban had brought heavy weapons to the party, and now Morrison's team was not just outnumbered, but outgunned. Rodriguez shielded Morrison's body with her own as shrapnel rained down around them. When the dust settled, Rodriguez assessed their tactical situation and realized it was hopeless. They were pinned down by small arms fire from 3 directions, taking mortar fire from a 4th, and their extraction helicopters were still 20 minutes away. Unless something changed dramatically, they were all going to die in this anonymous Afghan compound. That was when Rodriguez noticed the .50 caliber machine gun. It was mounted on a tripod about 30 feet away, behind the position where Morrison had been hit. One of the SEAL operators, Petty Officer Jenkins, had been manning it when he took a fatal headshot. The big gun was loaded and ready, but it was in the middle of the killing field. Rodriguez looked at the machine gun, then at Morrison, then at the tactical situation. She was a medic, not an infantry soldier. Her job was to save lives, not take them. But sometimes, she realized, the best way to save lives was to eliminate the threat. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need to reach that 50 cal." Morrison followed her gaze and immediately understood her intention. His expression shifted from protective commander to strategic tactician. He could see what Rodriguez saw. The machine gun was positioned perfectly to suppress the enemy firing positions and buy them enough time for extraction. "Doc, you're not trained for that weapon system." "Actually, sir, I am." Rodriguez met his eyes steadily. "I cross-trained on crew-served weapons at Camp Lejeune. I'm qualified on the M2. Morrison studied her face for a long moment, seeing something he had not noticed before. This was not just a medic who happened to be attached to his team. This was a warrior who happened to be trained in medicine. "The gun's got about 200 rounds left," Morrison said. "You'll need to lay down suppressive fire on the north wall first, then shift to the mortar position." Rodriguez nodded, already planning her movement. She would have to cross 30 feet of open ground, set up the weapon, and engage multiple targets while under fire. It was exactly the kind of thing she had trained for but never expected to actually do. She finished treating Morrison's wound and prepared to move. Her medical pack would have to stay behind. She needed to be fast and light. She kept only her sidearm, extra ammunition, and a single field dressing in case she took a hit. "Doc!" Morrison called as she prepared to move. She turned back to look at him. "Make every round count." Rodriguez sprinted toward the machine gun through a storm of enemy fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet and sparked off metal surfaces near her head, but she kept her focus on reaching the weapon. She dove the last 10 feet, landing hard behind the gun position as automatic weapons fire chewed up the ground where she had been running. The .50 caliber M2 machine gun was a monster of a weapon, designed to destroy vehicles and fortified positions. Rodriguez had fired it many times during training, but never in combat. She quickly checked the weapon's condition, confirmed it was loaded and ready, and began acquiring targets. The Taliban fighters on the north wall were the most immediate threat to her team. Rodriguez swung the heavy barrel toward their position, lined up her sights on the muzzle flashes, and pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life, sending huge .50 caliber rounds downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The concrete wall where the Taliban fighters were positioned simply disintegrated under the impact of the massive bullets. Enemy fighters who had been confidently shooting at Morrison's team suddenly found themselves exposed and under fire from a weapon that could punch through their cover like it was cardboard. Rodriguez walked her fire across the enemy position, methodically eliminating threats. The .50 cal's distinctive sound echoed across the compound, and she could see the psychological effect it was having on the remaining Taliban fighters. They had expected to face a small team with light weapons. They had not planned for sustained fire from a heavy machine gun. She shifted her aim to the mortar position, where Taliban fighters were trying to load another round. The .50 caliber rounds tore through their sandbag protection and silenced the mortar permanently. Without the indirect fire threat, Morrison's team could begin maneuvering again. "Doc's got the gun!" she heard someone shout over the radio. "All units, advance on my mark!" Rodriguez continued firing, suppressing enemy positions and allowing her teammates to move. She had found her rhythm with the big gun, controlling its recoil and managing her ammunition carefully. Each burst was precisely aimed and devastatingly effective, but she was not invincible, and the Taliban fighters were beginning to concentrate their fire on her position. Bullets struck the tripod and the gun shield, and Rodriguez knew she could not stay in this position much longer. She needed to displace before enemy fire found its mark. She was preparing to move when she heard Morrison's voice over the radio. "Doc, we've got Blackbird, but we need 30 more seconds of cover fire. Can you hold your position?" Rodriguez looked at her ammunition counter. She had less than 50 rounds remaining, and Taliban reinforcements were moving to flank her position. Staying meant almost certain death, but moving meant her team might not make it to the extraction point. The choice was easy. "Affirmative, Commander. I've got you covered." Rodriguez settled behind the machine gun and prepared for her final stand. The enemy fighters came from 2 directions at once, thinking they could overwhelm her position through sheer numbers. Rodriguez met them with sustained fire from the .50 cal, switching between targets with the precision of a sniper and the firepower of artillery. The big gun bucked and roared in her hands, sending streams of tracers into the enemy formations. She was down to her last 20 rounds when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive whop, whop, whop of approaching helicopters. The extraction birds were early, and they were coming in hot. Rodriguez expended her remaining ammunition in one final burst that scattered the last group of Taliban fighters, then grabbed her medical pack and ran for the landing zone. Morrison's team was already loading the injured and their intelligence asset aboard the helicopters, but Rodriguez could see that Morrison himself was in worse shape than she had initially realized. She climbed aboard the lead helicopter just as it lifted off, immediately moving to check on Morrison and the other wounded. As the aircraft gained altitude and headed toward safety, Rodriguez began the long process of keeping her patients alive during the flight to the field hospital. Only when they were safely in the air did Rodriguez allow herself to think about what had just happened. She had crossed a line tonight, moving from healer to warrior and back again. She had operated a crew-served weapon in combat, taken enemy lives, and saved the lives of her teammates. But most importantly, she had proven something to herself and to her team. She was not just a medic. She was a warrior who happened to be trained in medicine. Commander Morrison caught her eye across the helicopter cabin and nodded slightly. It was a small gesture, but Rodriguez understood its significance. She had earned the respect she had been seeking, not through politics or favoritism, but through competence under fire. The helicopter banked toward the medical facility, carrying its cargo of wounded warriors and one medic who would never be underestimated again. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez found herself in the medical tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman, stitching up a Marine who had walked into a door during a blackout drill. It was routine work, the kind of minor injuries that made up 90% of a combat medic's duties. But Rodriguez's mind kept drifting back to that compound, to the weight of the .50 caliber machine gun in her hands and the sound it made when it fired. The Marine she was treating, a young corporal named Williams, winced as she cleaned his split lip. "Doc, is it true you manned a .50 cal against the Taliban?" Rodriguez focused on her suturing, keeping her stitches small and even. "Who told you that?" "Everyone's talking about it. They say you saved a whole SEAL team." Rodriguez finished the last stitch and applied a bandage. "They say a lot of things. Most of them aren't true." But Williams was not the first person to ask her about the mission. Word had spread through the base, despite the classified nature of the operation. Rodriguez had become something of a legend, the medic who had crossed over into combat operations and lived to tell about it. Some of the stories were accurate. Most were wildly exaggerated. What Rodriguez had not expected was the change in how she was treated by the special operations community. Before the compound mission, she had been just another Navy medic assigned to support SEAL operations. Now, operators who had never spoken to her before were nodding respectfully when they passed her in the corridors. More importantly, she was being included in mission planning sessions that were usually restricted to combat personnel. Commander Morrison had recovered from his leg wound, though he walked with a slight limp that he claimed was temporary. He had submitted Rodriguez for a Bronze Star with V device for valor, despite her protests that she was just doing her job. The paperwork was still working its way through the chain of command, but Rodriguez knew that her actions at the compound had changed something fundamental about her career. She was finishing her shift in the medical tent when Chief Petty Officer Davis appeared at the entrance. Davis was Morrison's senior enlisted advisor, a man who had served with SEAL teams for over 20 years. His presence usually meant that something important was happening. "Doc, the commander wants to see you in the briefing room." Rodriguez cleaned up her medical supplies and followed Davis through the base. The briefing room was in the secure section of the compound, surrounded by concrete barriers and guarded by Marines with loaded weapons. She had been here several times since the compound mission, but it still felt strange to be included in meetings with operators who had decades of combat experience. Morrison was studying a map when she entered, his injured leg propped up on a chair. Also present were the other members of his team, including Petty Officer Chen, whose arm was still in a sling from the wound he had taken at the compound. The atmosphere in the room was tense, suggesting that this was not a routine briefing. "Have a seat, Doc," Morrison said without looking up from the map. "We've got a problem." The map showed a section of the Afghan-Pakistani border, mountainous terrain that was notoriously difficult for military operations. Rodriguez could see several red marks indicating known enemy positions, but one location was circled in black marker. 48 hours ago, a Chinook helicopter went down in this valley," Morrison continued, pointing to a spot deep in the mountains. 8 crew members aboard, including a flight surgeon who was being transferred to Kandahar. The bird took an RPG hit and managed to auto-rotate into a crash landing, but they're trapped in hostile territory. Rodriguez studied the map, noting the distance from the nearest friendly base and the number of enemy positions between the crash site and safety. "What's the status of the crew?" "Unknown. We lost radio contact after the initial Mayday call. Could be all dead, could be all alive, could be anywhere in between." That's why we need a medic on the extraction team. Morrison looked directly at Rodriguez. The flight surgeon on that bird is Commander Sarah Chen, one of the Navy's top trauma surgeons. If she's alive and injured, she'll need immediate medical attention that only another medical professional can provide. The problem is, this extraction is going to be a fighting withdrawal through 20 miles of enemy territory. Rodriguez understood immediately why she was being included in this briefing. The mission would require someone who could function as both a medic and a combatant. After her performance at the compound, she had proven she could handle both roles. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "We insert tomorrow night," Morrison replied. "The longer we wait, the less likely it is that any of the crew will still be alive. Taliban forces in that area have a history of taking prisoners, and it never ends well." Chief Davis spread out additional maps showing the insertion and extraction routes. "We'll insert by fast rope from helicopters at this landing zone, then move on foot to the crash site. Distance is approximately 8 miles through mountainous terrain with multiple enemy positions along the route." Rodriguez studied the route and felt her stomach tighten. This was not like the compound mission, where they had vehicle support and a clear extraction plan. This would be a deep penetration into enemy territory with no backup and no easy way out if things went wrong. "How many operators?" Rodriguez asked. 8, Morrison replied, "including you." Rodriguez looked around the room and realized that everyone was watching her reaction. They were offering her a spot on one of the most dangerous missions the team had attempted, and they wanted to see if she could handle the responsibility. "What about medical supplies? If Commander Chen is seriously injured, I'll need more than a standard aid bag." Morrison smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. We're modifying your equipment loadout to include surgical supplies and advanced trauma gear. You'll be carrying about 40 pounds of medical equipment in addition to your weapons and ammunition." Rodriguez nodded, already planning how she would configure her gear. 40 pounds of medical supplies meant she would have to be very selective about what to bring, prioritizing items that could save lives in austere conditions. "There's one more thing," Morrison continued. "Intelligence indicates that the Taliban fighters in this area are better trained and equipped than the ones we faced at the compound. We're looking at possible foreign fighter involvement, maybe Chechen or Pakistani militants. These guys will know how to use the terrain to their advantage." The briefing continued for another hour, covering every detail of the insertion, movement to target, and extraction plan. Rodriguez took notes and asked questions, but part of her mind was focused on the medical challenges she would face. If the helicopter crew had survived the crash, they could have injuries ranging from minor cuts to traumatic brain injuries. She would need to be prepared for anything. After the briefing, Rodriguez returned to her quarters and began modifying her equipment. She stripped down her gear to the absolute essentials, replacing items with dual-purpose alternatives wherever possible. Her rifle would be a shorter carbine version for easier movement in tight spaces. Her medical pack would contain enough supplies to perform emergency surgery in the field. She was checking her equipment one final time when Chen appeared in her doorway. The petty officer's wounded arm was improving, but he was still on limited duty. "Doc, can I talk to you for a minute?" Rodriguez gestured for him to sit down. Chen was one of the more experienced operators on the team, and his opinion carried weight with the others. "I wanted to thank you for what you did at the compound," Chen said. "I would have bled out if you hadn't reached me when you did." "Just doing my job," Rodriguez replied. "No, it was more than that. You put yourself at risk to save my life, then you went above and beyond to save all of us." Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. "The thing is, this mission tomorrow is different. The compound was bad, but this is going to be worse. You'll be in the mountains, far from any support, facing fighters who know the terrain better than we do." Rodriguez understood what Chen was trying to tell her. He was giving her an opportunity to back out of the mission without losing face. "Are you saying I shouldn't go?" "I'm saying You've already proven yourself. You don't need to do this." Rodriguez considered Chen's words. He was right that the mission was dangerous, probably more dangerous than anything she had done before. But she also knew that Commander Chen, the flight surgeon, would need immediate medical attention if she was going to survive. Rodriguez was the only person on the team qualified to provide that level of care. "I appreciate the concern," Rodriguez said finally. "But if our positions were reversed, would you stay behind?" Chen smiled ruefully. "No, I guess I wouldn't." The next evening, Rodriguez found herself crammed into a Black Hawk helicopter with 7 SEAL operators flying through the mountains toward the crash site. The helicopter flew low and fast, following valleys to avoid enemy radar and surface-to-air missiles. Rodriguez checked her equipment one more time and reviewed the medical protocols she might need to use. The insertion went smoothly. The Black Hawk hovered 20 feet above a rocky clearing while the team fast roped to the ground, then disappeared into the darkness. Rodriguez's boots hit the rocky ground, and she immediately moved to her assigned position in the patrol formation. The team moved through the mountains like ghosts, using night vision goggles to navigate the treacherous terrain. Rodriguez was impressed by the silence of their movement. 8 heavily armed operators moving through rocky terrain without making a sound. She tried to match their noise discipline, placing each footstep carefully on the loose stones. After 2 hours of movement, they reached a ridge overlooking the crash site. Morrison called a halt and deployed his team in observation positions while he studied the wreckage through high-powered binoculars. The Chinook helicopter was a twisted mass of metal at the bottom of a narrow valley. Its rotors shattered and its fuselage cracked open like an egg. There was no sign of movement around the aircraft, but Rodriguez could see several bodies that had been thrown from the wreckage during the crash. "I count 3 Taliban fighters near the bird," Morrison whispered into his radio. "No sign of survivors, but the main cabin is intact. Doc, what do you think?" Rodriguez studied the crash site through her own binoculars, looking for medical indicators. If anyone survived the initial impact, they'd be in the main cabin or thrown clear into the rocks. The Taliban fighters wouldn't be hanging around if there were active survivors fighting back. Morrison nodded grimly. "That means either everyone's dead or the survivors are too injured to resist. Either way, we need to get down there and check." The team began their descent into the valley, moving carefully through the rocks to avoid detection by the Taliban fighters. Rodriguez found herself thinking about Commander Chen, wondering if the flight surgeon was lying injured in the wreckage, waiting for rescue that might come too late. They were 50 meters from the helicopter when the first shots rang out. The Taliban fighters had been waiting in ambush positions, and they opened fire as soon as Morrison's team was committed to the open ground around the crash site. Rodriguez dove for cover behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead, her medical instincts warring with her combat training. "Contact left! 3 fighters in the rocks!" Morrison shouted. The firefight was brief but intense. Morrison's operators had superior training and equipment, and they methodically eliminated the Taliban fighters with precision rifle fire. But the gunshots would have alerted other enemy forces in the area, meaning the team had limited time to complete their search and extraction. Rodriguez reached the helicopter wreckage and immediately began searching for survivors. She found the first body wedged in the cockpit. The pilot killed instantly when a piece of the instrument panel crushed his skull during the crash. The co-pilot was nearby, also dead from massive trauma. But in the main cabin, Rodriguez found what she was looking for. Commander Sarah Chen was unconscious and badly injured, but she was alive. The flight surgeon had multiple fractures and probable internal bleeding, but her pulse was strong and her breathing was regular. Next to her, a crew chief named Peterson was conscious but trapped under a piece of wreckage that had pinned his legs. "Doc, what's the situation?" Morrison called from his security position. "2 survivors," Rodriguez replied, already beginning her medical assessment. One critical, one stable but trapped. I need 5 minutes to stabilize them for movement. Rodriguez worked quickly but carefully, starting IVs and administering pain medication while checking for life-threatening injuries. Commander Chen had suffered a severe head injury and possible internal bleeding, requiring immediate surgical intervention that Rodriguez could not provide in the field. The best she could do was stabilize the patient for transport to a proper medical facility. Peterson was conscious and alert, despite being trapped for over 40 hours. "Doc, am I going to lose my legs?" Rodriguez examined his injuries and found severe fractures but no signs of compartment syndrome or vascular damage. "You'll keep your legs, but you need surgery to repair the fractures. We're going to get you out of here." The team worked together to free Peterson from the wreckage, using leverage and careful coordination to move the debris without causing further injury. Meanwhile, Rodriguez prepared both patients for transport, knowing that the movement through rough terrain would be challenging for their injuries. They had just finished loading the survivors onto improvised stretchers when Morrison's radio crackled with bad news. "Alpha Team, be advised you have approximately 20 enemy fighters moving toward your position from the north. Recommend immediate extraction." Rodriguez looked at the 2 injured survivors and realized they had a serious problem. The original extraction plan called for the team to move quickly through the mountains to a pickup zone 8 miles away, but carrying 2 seriously injured patients over that distance would slow them down significantly, making them vulnerable to the pursuing Taliban fighters. Morrison reached the same conclusion. Change of plans. "We're calling for immediate helicopter extraction from this location." "Negative," came the reply from their command post. "Too much enemy activity in your area. The birds can't risk it." Rodriguez understood the situation immediately. They were trapped in enemy territory with 2 critically injured patients and a force of Taliban fighters closing in on their position. The helicopter extraction that was supposed to save them had been canceled, leaving them to fight their way out through 20 miles of hostile terrain. But Rodriguez had an idea that might save them all. "Commander," she said quietly, "what if we don't run?" Morrison looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" "The Taliban fighters are expecting us to retreat with the survivors. They're positioning themselves to block our escape routes. But what if we set up a defensive position here and hold until the helicopters can reach us?" Morrison considered the proposal. The crash site was in a narrow valley with good fields of fire and limited approach routes. With proper positioning, 8 operators could hold off a much larger force for a significant amount of time. "It's risky," Morrison said. "If we can't break contact when we need to, we're all dead." Rodriguez looked at the 2 injured survivors. Commander Chen was unconscious and would not survive being carried over rough terrain for 8 hours. Peterson could probably handle the movement, but his fractured legs would slow the entire team. "Sir, if we try to move with these patients, we'll all be dead anyway. At least here we can control the engagement." Morrison made his decision. "All right, Doc. We make our stand here." The team quickly established a defensive perimeter around the crash site, using the helicopter wreckage and natural rock formations as cover. Rodriguez set up a casualty collection point in the most protected area, where she could treat wounded team members while keeping the survivors safe. The Taliban attack came 20 minutes later. Rodriguez had never experienced anything like the intensity of that firefight. Enemy fighters attacked from multiple directions, using mortars and rocket-propelled grenades in addition to small arms fire. The sound was deafening, and the smell of explosives filled the narrow valley. But Morrison's team held their ground. Each operator controlled his sector of fire with precision, making every shot count and conserving ammunition for what they knew would be a long fight. Rodriguez found herself moving between wounded team members, treating injuries while staying low to avoid the incoming fire. Petty Officer Martinez took shrapnel in the face from an RPG explosion. Rodriguez cleaned and bandaged his wounds while he continued firing his rifle. Chief Davis was hit in the shoulder by rifle fire but refused evacuation, insisting that he could still fight effectively. The battle raged for 3 hours. Rodriguez lost track of how many times she moved between patients, treating everything from minor cuts to serious gunshot wounds. Her medical supplies were running low, and she was rationing morphine and antibiotics to make them last. But the team was holding. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, they had established fire superiority and were methodically reducing the enemy force. Rodriguez realized that this was what elite warriors looked like in their natural element: calm, professional, and utterly lethal. As dawn approached, Rodriguez heard the most beautiful sound in the world: the distinctive noise of approaching helicopters. The extraction birds had finally arrived, flying in formation through the mountain passes to reach the besieged team. The helicopters landed under fire, their door gunners laying down suppressive fire while Rodriguez and the team loaded the wounded aboard. Commander Chen was still unconscious but stable, and Peterson was conscious and complaining about the rough handling of his stretcher. Rodriguez was the last person to board the extraction helicopter, pausing to take one final look at the battlefield, where she had proven herself once again. She was no longer just a medic who happened to be assigned to a SEAL team. She was a full member of the team, a warrior who could fight alongside the best operators in the world. As the helicopter lifted off and headed towards safety, Rodriguez began treating the wounded team members, working to stabilize them for the flight to the medical facility. But for the first time since joining the special operations community, she felt like she truly belonged. She had started as merely a medic, but now she was something more. 6 months after the helicopter crash rescue, Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez stood in front of a full-length mirror in her quarters, adjusting the new insignia on her uniform. The bronze star with V device had finally come through, along with a promotion and transfer orders that would change everything about her military career. She was no longer just a Navy medic attached to SEAL operations. The special operations community had offered her something that had never been offered to a woman before: a chance to become a special amphibious reconnaissance corpsman, the elite medical specialists who served permanently with SEAL teams. The training would take 8 months and would be the most physically and mentally challenging thing she had ever attempted. But Rodriguez had accepted without hesitation. She had found her calling in those firefights, discovered that she could be both a healer and a warrior without compromising either role. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Commander Morrison entered, walking with only the slightest hint of his old leg injury. His recovery had been complete, and he had returned to full operational status. But Rodriguez could see new lines around his eyes, the kind that came from carrying the weight of command through too many dangerous missions. "Congratulations on the promotion, Sergeant," Morrison said, using her new rank. "You've earned it." "Thank you, sir. I hear you had something to do with the recommendation." Morrison smiled. "I just wrote down what happened. The promotion board made their own decision." He became more serious. "Actually, I'm here about something else. We've got one more mission before your transfer to the SARC program." Rodriguez felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. In her experience, when Morrison described something as one more mission, it usually meant something especially dangerous. "What's the situation?" Morrison handed her a classified briefing folder. "There's a terrorist training camp in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Intelligence indicates they're planning an attack on American forces using chemical weapons. We need to eliminate the facility and capture or kill the leadership before they can launch their operation." Rodriguez opened the folder and studied the aerial photographs of the target. The camp was built into a mountain valley, surrounded by steep cliffs and defended by multiple firing positions. It looked like a fortress designed specifically to resist military assault. "How many hostiles?" "Estimated 40 to 50 fighters, including foreign trainers with significant military experience. The camp commander is a former Iraqi Republican Guard colonel who's been training militants for the past 5 years. Morrison pointed to a building in the center of the compound. This is where intelligence believes they're storing the chemical weapons. Rodriguez studied the target more carefully, noting the tactical challenges. The camp was too well defended for a direct assault, and the terrain would make movement difficult. Worse, the presence of chemical weapons meant that any firefight could release deadly toxins into the environment. What's the mission profile? Surgical strike. 8 operators insert by helicopter, neutralize the leadership, destroy the chemical weapons, and extract. Minimal collateral damage, maximum precision. Morrison met her eyes. The problem is that if anyone gets exposed to chemical agents, we'll need immediate medical intervention that goes beyond standard combat first aid. Rodriguez understood immediately why she was being included. Chemical weapons exposure required specialized medical knowledge and advanced treatment protocols. A regular medic might be able to treat gunshot wounds, but treating nerve agent poisoning required someone with her level of training. What kind of chemical agents are we talking about? Unknown, but probably some variant of nerve gas or blister agent, the kind of thing that kills within minutes if not treated immediately. Morrison's expression was grim. Doc, I'm not going to lie to you. This mission has a high probability of casualties, and you'll be the only thing standing between poisoned operators and death. Rodriguez closed the briefing folder and looked out her window at the Afghan mountains. She had come a long way from the nervous medic who had worried about earning respect from SEAL operators. Now she was being asked to participate in one of the most dangerous missions in special operations, a chemical weapons raid deep in enemy territory. When do we leave? Tomorrow night. You'll have 12 hours to prepare your equipment and review the chemical exposure protocols. Morrison paused at the door. Doc, this is voluntary. Given your upcoming transfer, no one would blame you if you decided to sit this one out. Rodriguez considered the offer for exactly 3 seconds. I'll be ready. Sir. The next evening found Rodriguez once again loading onto a helicopter with Morrison's team, but this time her equipment was different. In addition to her standard medical supplies and weapons, she carried atropine injectors, marked Afard decontamination kits, and a portable ventilator for treating respiratory paralysis. Her uniform included chemical protective gear that would allow her to function in a contaminated environment. The flight to the target took 2 hours through mountain valleys, with the helicopters flying low to avoid detection. Rodriguez used the time to review her chemical exposure protocols and check her equipment one final time. She had studied every known chemical weapon and memorized the treatment procedures, but she knew that theoretical knowledge was very different from treating dying patients in the middle of a firefight. The team fast-roped into a landing zone 5 miles from the target and began their approach through the mountains. Rodriguez found herself thinking about how much had changed since her first mission with this team. Then she had been struggling just to keep up with the physical demands of special operations. Now she moved through the terrain with the same silent efficiency as the operators around her. They reached the observation position overlooking the terrorist camp just after midnight. Through her night vision scope, Rodriguez could see sentries patrolling the perimeter and movement in the buildings. The camp was active, with people moving between structures and vehicles coming and going. Morrison deployed his team in assault positions, while Rodriguez established a casualty collection point behind cover. Her medical station was positioned to provide immediate treatment while staying protected from enemy fire and potential chemical contamination. The assault began with simultaneous strikes on the guard positions. Morrison's operators moved like shadows, eliminating sentries with suppressed weapons before they could raise an alarm. Rodriguez watched through her scope as the team systematically cleared the outer defenses, working their way toward the central compound where the chemical weapons were stored. Everything went wrong when they reached the main laboratory building. The first explosion came without warning, a massive blast that lit up the entire valley. The terrorists had booby-trapped their chemical weapons storage, and the explosion had ruptured several containers. Rodriguez could see a pale green cloud spreading from the damaged building, and she knew immediately that they were dealing with chlorine gas or something similar. "Chemical release! Chemical release!" Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "All personnel, protective masks and mop gear, now!" Rodriguez was already pulling on her chemical protection equipment when she saw the first casualty. Petty Officer Williams had been closest to the explosion and had caught a full dose of the chemical cloud before he could get his mask on. He was stumbling toward Rodriguez's position, his face already showing signs of chemical burns. Rodriguez grabbed Williams as he collapsed and immediately began treatment. Chemical weapons attacked the respiratory system, the nervous system, or both, depending on the agent. Williams was showing signs of chlorine poisoning, difficulty breathing, chest pain, and irritation of the eyes and throat. She started an IV and administered bronchodilators to open his airways while monitoring his oxygen saturation. The chemical had damaged his lungs, making it difficult for his body to absorb oxygen from the air. Rodriguez knew that without immediate advanced treatment, Williams would suffocate despite having clear airways. "Doc, we've got 2 more casualties incoming." Chief Davis's voice came over the radio. Rodriguez looked up to see Martinez and Johnson moving toward her position, both showing signs of chemical exposure. Martinez was conscious, but having difficulty breathing, while Johnson appeared to be suffering from neurological effects that suggested nerve agent exposure. Rodriguez quickly triaged the 3 patients, determining that Johnson was in the most immediate danger. Nerve agents attacked the nervous system, causing muscle paralysis and respiratory failure. She administered atropine and pralidoxim from her chemical antidote kit while connecting Johnson to her portable ventilator. Meanwhile, Martinez was developing symptoms similar to Williams, chemical burns and respiratory distress. Rodriguez started him on the same treatment protocol while monitoring all 3 patients for signs of deterioration. The firefight was still raging around the camp. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the heavier boom of grenades as Morrison's remaining operators fought to complete their mission. But she was focused entirely on keeping her patients alive in what had become a field hospital in the middle of a chemical weapons disaster. Williams was the most stable of the 3, responding well to the bronchodilator treatment and showing improving oxygen levels. But Johnson was getting worse despite the antidotes, his breathing becoming more labored as the nerve agent continued to attack his respiratory system. Rodriguez made a decision that went against every protocol she had learned. Johnson needed advanced airway management that could only be provided by emergency surgery, and there was no time to evacuate him to a field hospital. She would have to perform a battlefield cricothyrotomy, cutting directly into his throat to establish an airway. Working by the light of a red filtered flashlight, Rodriguez made a precise incision in Johnson's neck just below his Adam's apple. Blood welled up from the cut, but she quickly inserted a breathing tube that would bypass his paralyzed upper airway. Johnson's oxygen levels immediately began improving as the ventilator forced air directly into his lungs. Martinez was holding steady with supportive care, but Rodriguez could see that his lung damage was more severe than Williams. He would need immediate evacuation to a facility with advanced respiratory support, or he would not survive the night. "Doc, what's your patient's status?" Morrison's voice came over the radio. 3 casualties, 1 critical, 2 serious. "I need immediate helicopter evacuation for all 3 patients." "Negative. The landing zone is contaminated with chemical agents. The birds can't land until the area is decontaminated." Rodriguez felt her heart sink. The 3 patients needed advanced medical care that she could not provide in the field, but the chemical contamination made helicopter evacuation impossible. She would have to keep them alive with portable equipment until the area could be declared safe. She checked her medical supplies and realized she had a serious problem. The chemical antidotes were running low, and Johnson would need continued doses to prevent the nerve agent from overwhelming his system. Martinez and Williams both needed respiratory support that her portable equipment could not provide indefinitely. Rodriguez made a mental calculation of her remaining supplies and the time it would take to decontaminate the landing zone. The numbers did not work in her favor. Unless something changed quickly, at least one of her patients was going to die. That was when she heard Morrison's voice over the radio with news that changed everything. "Doc, we've captured the terrorist leader alive. He's offering to provide intelligence about other chemical weapons sites in exchange for medical treatment." Rodriguez looked across the battlefield and saw Morrison's team emerging from the laboratory complex with a bearded man in handcuffs. The terrorist was obviously injured, probably from the same explosion that had wounded her patients. "What's his condition?" Rodriguez asked. "Gunshot wound to the leg and possible chemical exposure. Conscious and alert, but losing blood." Rodriguez faced a decision that defined everything she believed about her role as a medic. The terrorist leader was responsible for the chemical weapons that had injured her teammates. He was planning attacks that would kill American soldiers. By any reasonable standard, he deserved to die for his crimes. But Rodriguez was a medic, and medics treated everyone who needed medical care, regardless of who they were or what they had done. Her oath required her to save lives, not make moral judgments about who deserved to live. "Bring him to my position," Rodriguez said. "I'll treat him." She could hear the surprise in Morrison's voice. "Doc, are you sure? This guy was planning to kill Americans with chemical weapons." "I'm sure, sir." "Bring him here." Morrison's team delivered the terrorist leader to Rodriguez's casualty collection point. The man was middle-aged, with intelligent eyes and extensive chemical burns on his hands and face. He spoke English with a heavy accent, probably educated in Western universities before becoming a terrorist. Rodriguez began treating his wounds with the same professional efficiency she used for her own teammates. She cleaned and bandaged his chemical burns, started an IV to replace lost fluids, and administered pain medication. The terrorist watched her work with obvious surprise, perhaps expecting to be left to die. "Why are you helping me?" he asked in heavily accented English. Rodriguez continued working without looking at his face. "Because you're injured, and I'm a medic." The terrorist was quiet for several minutes while Rodriguez treated his wounds. When she finished, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "The American soldiers who were exposed, there is an antidote in the laboratory, a more effective treatment than what you are using." Rodriguez stopped what she was doing and looked directly at the terrorist. "What kind of antidote?" "My chemists developed a more advanced version of the standard treatments. It is in the safe in my office, along with instructions for its use." Rodriguez felt a surge of hope. If there was a better treatment available, it might be enough to save Martinez and the others until they could be evacuated. "Why are you telling me this?" The terrorist looked at Johnson, who was unconscious but breathing with the help of Rodriguez's ventilator. "Because you did not leave me to die, even though you had good reason to do so. Perhaps there is still honor in this war." Rodriguez called Morrison over the radio and explained the situation. 20 minutes later, Chief Davis arrived at the casualty collection point, carrying a metal case recovered from the terrorist laboratory. Inside were vials of clear liquid and detailed instructions for treating chemical weapons exposure. Following the terrorist's instructions, Rodriguez administered the advanced antidote to all 3 of her patients. The results were dramatic and immediate. Johnson's breathing improved significantly, allowing her to reduce his dependence on the ventilator. Martinez's oxygen levels stabilized, and Williams showed rapid improvement in his chemical burns. 2 hours later, when helicopters finally arrived to evacuate the wounded, all 3 patients were stable and expected to make full recoveries. Rodriguez was loading the last patient onto the helicopter when Morrison approached her. "Doc, what you did tonight?" Treating that terrorist after what he did to our guys, that took real courage. Rodriguez looked back at the terrorist, who was being loaded onto a separate helicopter under guard. His information about the advanced antidote had saved 3 American lives, information he had provided because she had chosen to treat him with dignity. "I'm a medic, sir. I treat people who need medical care. That's what I swore to do." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's what makes you special, Doc. You never forgot who you were, even after you became one of us." As the helicopters lifted off and headed toward safety, Rodriguez thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as merely a medic, someone who happened to be assigned to a SEAL team. She had proven herself as a warrior in combat, earning the respect of operators who had initially doubted her abilities. But tonight had shown her something important. She could be a warrior when her team needed her to fight, but she would always be a medic first. Her true strength was not in her ability to take lives, but in her commitment to saving them, regardless of the circumstances. The helicopter banked toward the medical facility, carrying its cargo of wounded warriors and one medic who had finally understood her true purpose. She was not merely a medic who could fight. She was a healer who would never abandon her calling, no matter how dark the battlefield became. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez stood on the tarmac at Kandahar Air Base, waiting for the transport plane that would take her back to the United States for SARC training. Commander Morrison and the rest of the team had come to see her off, a rare show of respect in the special operations community. "Take care of yourself, Doc," Morrison said, shaking her hand. "The SARC program is lucky to have you." Rodriguez shouldered her gear bag and looked one last time at the mountains of Afghanistan. She had come here as an untested Navy medic looking for respect and adventure. She was leaving as something much more valuable, a warrior who had never forgotten her true calling as a healer. As the transport plane lifted off and headed toward home, Rodriguez settled back in her seat and closed her eyes. She was no longer merely a medic. She was exactly what the world needed, a protector of life in all its forms, whether on a battlefield or in a hospital, whether treating friend or enemy. She had found her true identity not by abandoning her medical training, but by combining it with the warrior skills she had learned from the best operators in the world. She was living proof that the strongest warriors were not always those who took the most lives, but sometimes those who saved them. The plane climbed higher into the sky, carrying Rodriguez toward the next chapter of her story. She was ready for whatever challenges awaited, secure in the knowledge that she could handle anything the world threw at her. After all, she had been merely a medic once. Now she was much more.